Welcome to Unfinished Conversations, where turning silence into strength happens one voice at a time. Here is your host, Rebecca Lombardo.
Hello and welcome to Unfinished Conversations with Rebecca Lombardo. I am your host, Rebecca Lombardo. Today I am chatting with Michelle F. Moseley, a licensed health counselor from North Carolina who specializes in working with those who have experienced religious harm. Welcome today, Michelle.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here.
I am glad to have you. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in, and we'll start off with asking you the very first question that I have is, for those who may not be aware, what is religious harm and how does it present in different people?
Yeah. So religious harm is a term that can be used to describe a lot of things. It can include religious trauma. It can include spiritual abuse. Religious harm really can include anything that is a situation, is something that happens in a religious context that harms a person in some way that overwhelms their nervous system. So there's an official definition for religious trauma. So religious trauma is often defined as the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope and to return to a sense of safety. And religious trauma is part of religious harm, but as I said, that also can include spiritual abuse. That can include what is sometimes known as adverse religious experiences, really anything that happens in a religious context that causes harm to a person.
Oh, okay. You shared previously the spiritual abuse that you dealt with affected your mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical self. For someone listening who may be questioning their own experience, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah, I think it can be really important to understand what spiritual abuse is,
Mhm.
and to recognize that in some cases, the perpetrator who abused you may have meant to, it may have been intentional. There's a lot of situations where someone is in a religious system and they're carrying out their role and abuse happens, and they didn't necessarily mean for abuse to happen, but that misuse of power and it can really show up in doubting yourself, not being sure who you are, struggling to make decisions, maybe because the person who was spiritually abusing you told you that they had to, like you had to run all of your decisions past them and that kind of thing. So often when I'm working with folks, sometimes initially they identify that they have had spiritual abuse. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's more of a sense of something is off. It has impacted me. I'm dealing with some anxiety. I feel judged by people. Maybe I feel judged by God or my higher
Mm,
power. I'm feeling really depressed. And when we start unpacking things, we realize that some of the things that happened in their religious context were abusive.
mm, okay. Uh, that has to be incredibly painful
Mm,
idea to come to terms with.
yeah, it is.
Someone
And
that you
it's so
trust that
complex.
much.
Yes, the
Hmm.
betrayal in there and
Hmm.
the complexity that for a lot of people, their religious space was very supportive. It's a place where they found meaning making for life. It was
Hmm.
really important to them. They may have had some really positive experiences there. And so
Hmm.
trying to balance that with, okay, but these good and healthy and helpful things are part of that, and these harmful things are part of that, and it's impacting me and then trying to figure out, well, how do I move forward with
Right.
both of these things being true?
And what what is a common way to move forward? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I do think that therapy with a licensed therapist who understands religious trauma can be really important,
Hmm.
an important part of that healing or recovery journey. I include the caveats of a licensed therapist because there are some people who don't have training in mental health and will call themselves a therapist or a counselor. So it's important to check that out. And I also include someone who has specific training around religious trauma because religious trauma is its own special complex type of trauma. And someone who is trauma informed, they may be able to do some good work with it, but it can be really helpful to have somebody that really understands religious trauma. And then just learning to trust yourself, slowly kind of testing out, like, can I make decisions? What are the things I actually value in life? Those are some of the things that a therapist can be really helpful in supporting you with. Finding community, with folks that are not going to push you toward any particular religious belief system. I feel like that is so important, because for some folks, they really want to hold on to their beliefs. And for other folks, they don't want anything to do with religion. And a lot of folks are somewhere on a spectrum in there as
Mm-hmm.
far as how they feel about faith or religion or spirituality.
Um, how would you explain the difference between religious trauma and spiritual abuse in a way that feels, easy for people to understand?
Yeah. So spiritual abuse, is when power is misused in a spiritual setting. And so it can take a lot of different forms. Sometimes spiritual abuse includes other types of abuse, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse. Um, and for some folks who experience spiritual abuse, it leads to religious trauma, because any type of trauma is all about how the experience lands in that person's nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
So, did the experience overwhelm that person's nervous system, that they didn't feel like they had the resources to cope, and they couldn't return to a sense of safety, both internally and in the community? So sometimes a person experiences spiritual abuse, but they don't end up with religious trauma. They don't identify with that term. In my case, I experienced spiritual abuse, and the term religious trauma really fit my experience. And it was actually a therapist that I was working with who said to me, she was like, Michelle, it really sounds like you're having a trauma response to what you've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really helpful for me at the time, of like, oh, there's a reason
Right.
that my emotions and my brain and my body are responding to
Mm-hmm.
this way.
I've heard about it a little bit more recently. It's not something that you hear a great deal about,
Mm-hmm.
at least in my experience. But I have a group, a depression group on Facebook, and it's been kind of a battle because there's a lot of folks who like to say, I'll pray for you, or God bless you, or things like that. And then there's a whole contingency of people who are completely against that, because they say,
Mm.
you don't know whether or not someone has been abused spiritually, or that they have religious trauma in their past.
Yeah.
And you could be bringing all that up all over again. So I have to constantly be aware of who's saying what to who, because it's so sensitive and so powerful, the what they've experienced.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's there's just a fine line between what's acceptable and what isn't. And I'm really noticing it a lot nowadays.
Yes. And paying attention to how something lands for the other person.
Hmm.
Like, there are lots of people who might say, I'll pray for you, and they mean that very sincerely,
Hmm.
and they really do care about the person. And for the person they're saying it to,
Hmm.
that they're like, I don't believe in prayer. I don't want your prayer. I've had negative experiences with prayer, and that actually sounds horrible to me or feels harmful to me. So being aware of, how does this land with the person that you're talking to?
Right. And it can start really big arguments and fights and things that
Mm-hmm.
I've got to go back in and, kind of break up and smooth over, and, sometimes even like ask people to leave the group. It's
Yeah. I mean, that speaks to how personal
mhm,
our spirituality, our faith, our identities around what we believe is.
right.
Um, what a big part of us it is, which is
Hmm.
another reason that if somebody experiences abuse or trauma in a religious space, that it really can be so impactful, because that's such an important part of so many people's lives.
Absolutely. So you also work to kind of change the topic a little bit, but you
Mhm.
also work with late identified neurodivergent women.
Mm-hmm.
What are some common experiences you hear from women who later discover they may be ADHD, autistic, or AUDHD, which is new for me. I did not know
Mm-hmm.
what that was.
Yes, yes. So a lot of folks will pronounce that ADHD.
Mm.
Um, and it's not an official diagnosis, but it is a term that a lot of folks who meet the criteria both for ADHD and for autism will
Mm.
use to describe themselves. ADHD, that it puts
Oh, that's
together
how you say it.
the
Okay.
experience. That's how a lot of people say it.
Okay.
Not everyone, but that's how a lot of people will say it. I think it's important to recognize that neurodivergence is not only autism or ADHD. Neurodivergent is a term that was coined to describe anybody who has a brain that diverges from whatever their society considers as quote unquote typical or normal.
Mm.
And so there's lots of things that fall under that umbrella. Lots of times when the term neurodivergent is tossed around now, people are talking about ADHD, autism, but
Mhm.
there's many other things that can fit under that term. But yeah, a lot of women that are realizing later in life that ADHD or autism or both are part of their experience are coming to terms with the fact that they've worked really hard to mask, to build structures into their life so that they could perform what it feels like to be a human, to try to
Mm.
fit into maybe it was school groups or fit in with coworkers, or figure out what does it look like to socially interact with people. How do I manage my calendar in a way that it doesn't look like I'm a failure?
Mm.
And so they're putting a lot of effort into all of this managing. And a lot of women will come seeking a diagnosis or trying to figure out what's going on when their hormones start to shift in perimenopause.
Mm.
And some of
Mhm.
that structuring or that scaffolding isn't working anymore. And it's like, what is wrong? Why is this feeling so different for me? And so unpacking that, there's often what is commonly called a grief and relief cycle
Mhm.
of there can be some relief in getting a diagnosis, in being identified of, oh my goodness, that sheds a lot of light on what's happening. That helps me understand my experience. But also grief of, wow, this really has been hard for me. I've been putting so much energy into trying to fit into society, to appear quote unquote normal, whatever that is.
Mhm.
Um, and also, what might life have looked like if this had been known earlier and I had gotten different
Right.
supports?
Mhm.
Um, I also find that with a lot of the women I work with, that they did really well academically.
Mm.
And so that that covered a lot of things. They were never considered a behavior problem. They didn't struggle academically in school. And so a lot of times they were missed.
Mhm.
Nobody even considered, is there ADHD here? Is there autism here? Is there something going on? Is this child struggling in some way?
What what does that look like in adulthood? What do they start to notice that would, have them seeing someone and asking the question, could this be me?
hmm Are you thinking about for any of those three things, ADHD,
Yeah, yeah.
autism, or
Mhm.
ADHD? Okay. So a lot of times when somebody starts thinking about ADHD, they might notice, wow, I am forgetting a lot of things. Every task feels like it has 400 pieces to it.
Mhm.
So it might be, okay, well, I have a watermelon and I want to have cut it up and have watermelon for snacks throughout the week. Okay, well, that means I have to get the watermelon in the right place and I have to find the right knife to cut the watermelon and then I have to do it the right way. And I need a certain amount of, um, Tupperware or whatever
Mhm.
to put the watermelon in. And do I have room in the fridge? And it just becomes this cascade of so many tasks that it feels overwhelming.
Mhm.
Um, and so some folks will start noticing that. A lot of women will also notice that there is a lot of hyperactivity that is mental. So
Yeah.
maybe their mind is constantly running through lists. They're waking up in the middle of the night, running through all of the things they have to get done. Some will even have created a system where they keep a lot of lists everywhere
Mhm.
to help them stay on track. And so often one of the reasons they were missed is because one of the questions that's commonly asked is, do you get up and out of your chair during a meeting? And a lot of the folks I work with are like, well, no, because I know I'm not supposed to get up out of my chair. I might be fidgeting like crazy,
Mm.
I'm moving my toes or my feet inside of my shoes, or I have a pen and I'm always taking notes, or I move my hands around a lot, or I'm twirling my hair, but I stay in my seat. And so
Mhm.
they got missed. So
Uh,
that's just some with that. For a lot of folks with autism, especially probably in the past 5-ish years, more autistic adults have been able to talk about their experience internally, because the criteria that we look at in the DSM to diagnose autism is very based on external experience, and what other people can observe. And
mm,
so a lot of adults now, as they hear other autistic adults talk about what it feels like to interact with other people and that feeling of like trying to understand and perform social engagement, the feeling of being completely overwhelmed by sensory input and not being able to put words to that, of feeling completely exhausted and needing days to recover, even after something that you really enjoyed doing and looked forward
yeah.
to. So folks will start noticing things like that. And then for a lot of folks, if they start noticing some of both sides, they're like, I wonder if ADHD is part of the picture.
Mm.
Um,
It's very interesting. You know, some of it kind of sounds familiar.
yeah, a lot of folks, they start thinking about these things and they're like,
Mm.
some of these pieces sound familiar.
Mhm.
And
Especially.
I think
Mm.
it's important to recognize that, like, as humans, we probably identify with some of these things.
Mhm.
So, doesn't necessarily mean that it is a diagnosis. And I also think self diagnosis is valid. We
Mhm.
know ourselves best. And
Right.
so, when a lot of folks, especially once they are actually pursuing a diagnosis or they're wanting to talk to a professional about it, they've done a lot of research. Like
Mhm.
they will have a whole list of reasons of like, this is why I think this. This is how I fit with what I understand. Help me make sense of this.
You think that's the best way to go if you're trying to get help for something like that, is to, come to terms with it and write down a big list and go to see somebody and say, hey, this is it. This is what's going on.
I would hesitate to say there's one best way because I think everybody's circumstance varies.
Mm-hmm.
There are various reasons that folks may not want to or be able to talk with a professional, whether that is particular identities that they carry and they don't feel like those will be honored.
Mm-hmm.
If they fear working with somebody that doesn't understand more of what's commonly called like a high masking presentation. Um, Money,
Yeah.
getting evaluated is very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's very real reasons that some people don't want an official diagnosis on the books somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think for some people, pursuing that officially can be helpful. For other people, that may not be part of the path they want to take. One thing that I do, I offer assessments for ADHD and autism for adults, but they are private pay. So we don't have to put a diagnosis anywhere official that goes on your medical record. If somebody meets criteria for a diagnosis, and they get the information that if they want to share that diagnosis with somebody, they can, but they get to control that. It doesn't just go in a medical record somewhere that anybody has access to.
You were confirmed autistic at 43.
Mm-hmm.
What was that process like for you, and how did it change the way you understood your life?
Yeah. So probably around the age of 30, I started putting some pieces together. Um, and um, about a couple years after I turned 30 was when the current criteria for autism and ADHD was updated, and that was the first time that people really started looking at autism can be present without an intellectual disability.
Mm.
Because I'd known things were kind of off. I knew social situations were hard. I identified with the special interest kind of piece of autism, but I had done well in school. And so it wasn't it wasn't a thing to have an autism diagnosis. And I started thinking, I feel like if I was a child now, that I would definitely be referred for an evaluation. The first couple of providers that I mentioned that to kind of brushed it off. I think that there was definitely less understanding about neurodivergence and autism and how it can present differently than there is now.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of them were under the impression of like, oh, but you did well in school and like you can hold down a job. Like, no, that doesn't make sense for you.
Mhm.
And so then when I was around 40, I started interacting with a lot of other mental health professionals that had been late diagnosed or identified themselves, that worked in very neurodivergent affirming spaces, and that were really focused on increasing the understanding of what a high masking presentation can look like, what a presentation in women often looks like. And so having a lot of conversations with them, going through the process of like, these are the things I'm noticing. Um, what do you think? Like getting that feedback from other professionals in the field. I personally chose not to go through the official diagnostic route, both for financial reasons and I own my own business. I'm in private practice. I don't need a diagnosis somewhere for accommodations or anything like that.
Mhm.
But I went through the process of kind of having discussions around being evaluated with lots of people who understand autism, and having that confirmed in multiple spots of like, yes, this makes sense. This makes sense of a lot of my experiences. And for me, that grief and relief has been very real. And it is an
Mhm.
ongoing cycle of, oh my gosh, this makes sense. Like, wow, there's so many things throughout life that I can now be like, oh, it makes sense that that was difficult, or I didn't pick up on that, or I approached it this way, or I said something that came across as very um, like terse or harsh, but really I was just stating the facts
Mhm.
in a very logical way and
Right.
not sugarcoating things a lot, which, especially as a woman in the South, there's some
Mhm.
expectation of sugarcoating things.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's been a lot of grief around, wow, if someone had known this earlier, what would that
Right.
have looked like? What would
Right.
the supports have looked like? What would it have looked like in my family for my parents to have an understanding of what was happening? Because there's
Mhm.
definitely times where I got in trouble for being what my mom would often call a smart aleck.
Mhm.
And I didn't understand. But I'm not being smart. Like I really was just answering the question. I wasn't trying to be smart or disrespectful.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of a long answer
Oh
to
no, no,
the
I
question.
like
But
long
yeah,
answers.
it's definitely been a process and like being in my 40s and okay, well, what does this mean now?
Kind of a reinventing yourself type thing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's happening a lot, nowadays with women in 40s and 50s and
Hmm.
whatnot. It's a whole reinvention saga going on out there nowadays.
Yeah.
I know it's had to happen for me. I didn't have any choice in the matter, um,
Hmm.
and it's been hard work, but it's worth it, you know.
It is. And
Hmm.
I think it's hard to remember that in the midst sometimes
Oh yeah.
when you're doing the hard work of like,
Hmm.
okay, this is going to lead me somewhere that I
Hmm.
want to be.
Yeah. Especially when you're sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning staring at the ceiling.
Hmm.
You also um, incorporate um, a weight inclusive perspective.
Hmm.
What does weight inclusive mental health care mean?
Yeah. So, weight inclusive care just means that a person is viewed as a person, that their weight doesn't become the focus of how they're treated, and that they're able to access care, whether that means that they're physically able to get into the building, that there is seating that is comfortable and works well for them. Um, if this doesn't apply as much in a mental health care framework, but in a medical setting, that there is equipment that works
Hmm.
for their body. So maybe different blood pressure cuffs or different kinds of machines that work for various size bodies.
Hmm.
It also means that any kind of decor that might be in an office or images that I choose to put on my website, that there are a variety of body sizes there. I work with a lot of folks on body image concerns and on feeling disconnected from their body. And For me, the focus is not on that your body has to be a certain shape or size, or that you need to see a certain number on the scale or on the tag in your clothing. Sometimes I'm working with folks that is a goal that they have, and I will, support them where they are. But I'm also very open about my framework, that we're not focused on changing your body, that we're focused on helping you reach whatever your health goals are, and that doesn't have to be shrinking your body in some way.
Right. There's so much public pressure right now about weight loss and shrinking your body, as you stated. How do you talk about body autonomy without adding more shame to it?
Yeah. Body autonomy I think it's so important. And I think it's a phrase that is often maybe given some lip service, but not actually respected. So that's a big thing that I talk about with the folks I work with, of you get to decide what works for your body. My hope is that you have all of the information about your different options. And if you're talking to someone that is very invested in you going one direction or another with anything related to your health, they may not be giving you all of the information. And it's really important to have informed consent, which can't happen if you don't have all the information. So, a big thing that will come up, especially recently, is around GLP-1s. And those are very helpful medications. For some things, they have been shown to be very helpful with blood sugar control for folks with diabetes. There's other things that they may be helpful with. And I know that they are pushed on a lot of people, without really any information or any discussion. Just, here, take this, you'll lose weight. I had my own experience with that with a provider. I've worked with lots of clients that will be like, I don't know if I want to do this, but I feel like my doctor's not listening, or I have these questions, but I feel like they're not getting answered. And so trying to help build that self-advocacy with my clients of like, you get to ask questions about a medication that's being suggested to you. And you ultimately get to decide whether that medication is something that you want to take or not take. Your doctor can't control that. They're there to give you a recommendation and to give you information. So that's one way of building that bodily autonomy, is you get to do this and giving them opportunities to practice. Like sometimes we'll even role play something of like, okay, well, push back on me. Like, ask me a question about something. Let's role play what this might be like to almost feel like you're coming back at a professional, and to remember that you get to control what happens to your body.
What does healing look like when someone is trying to rebuild trust in themselves?
I wish there was a pretty like one path answer of healing is A, B, and C. If you do this, then you will be healed. Healing is messy.
Yeah.
And so it is so often a million little moments. That every once in a while you get these big moments of like, oh, that's very different. But it is all the work in between. And so those little moments of even, sometimes I will work with folks, whether they're coming out of a high control religion, or they're dealing with body image, or they're learning about their own neurodivergence, who are like, I don't even know how to make a decision. Like, how do I choose something? And so it might start with something that feels maybe small and not threatening and not risky, of like, okay, well, you could have Coke or Pepsi. There's not really a right or a wrong. It's just a matter of preference. Which one do you want to try? And you don't have to have that one for the rest of your life. You can take 2 sips of it and say, I don't want this anymore. And just practicing making some of those decisions that feel less earth-shattering or life-altering, to build up to be able to have that more strength of autonomy and move toward healing, to really examine and explore the parts of yourself that were harmed. How is that showing up in your life? And all of these things I work with can be really interrelated. Like I work with some folks that, body image is part of it, religious trauma is part of it, and some neurodivergence is part of it. And so we're unpacking like, how are these things all entangled? And what part of this do you want to hold on to? Because often there is a part of it that that folks are like, but this is really valuable. This is part of me. I want to keep this.
Right.
Yeah. So exploring values as well. What were the values that you were given about who you should be, or what your body should look like, or what you should be able to accomplish, and which part of those values actually resonate for you. So that's all of that is part of that recovery or healing journey.
If someone listening recognizes themselves in this conversation, but feels overwhelmed, what is one small first step that they could possibly take?
Yeah. Oh, that is hard to answer because people are so different.
Yes.
For some people, finding more information.
Mm,
So even just if something sparked and you're like, oh, spiritual abuse, I've never heard of that. What does that mean? Or neurodivergence, I've heard that word, but I didn't really know what it meant. Or I've never thought about interacting with my body in a way that wasn't focused on changing it. Like just gaining some information, finding some podcast that maybe speak on that topic or that subject, doing an internet search, asking if you have somebody around you that you trust. Hey, do you know anything about this?
mm-hmm.
I have lots of resources on all of those areas on my website. So if somebody wants to take a deep dive, if blogs are more of their thing, that might be a path for them to
Mm-hmm.
gain some information. Um, I think often that is the next step of, okay, well, let me learn more about this. How does this apply to me?
And this might be kind of controversial, but just as a side note, I have found that Gemini or Chat GPT are exceptional resources. If you use them the right way. I'm not
Mm,
talking about, having them do, anything nefarious. But if you do actually have a real question and you have a minute and you can go to one of those, the answers that they come up with are really detailed, really accurate, and very, very helpful. And I know that there's people out there that hate both of those, and I'm sorry for, for being on that side of the fence, but I do use both of them for when I really, really need an answer
yeah,
for something, and I've found some really great work
yeah.
with
Well,
them.
I mean, that's honestly an important thing to mention
Mm-hmm.
in this time period we're living in, because
Mm-hmm.
I have my own personal feelings about generative AI,
Mm-hmm.
and I also know that folks are using it as a resource, and for some folks, it is the first line resource that they have access to.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to look some things up, get information. Sometimes I know, at least with religious trauma, like you can look and seek, where can I find more information, and it can give you
Mm-hmm.
resources. I've even had folks that have found me for therapy, and when I asked them how, they're like, I typed into ChatGPT, like, who is a religious trauma therapist in North Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
and your information came up. So then they ended up on my website.
Yeah.
So I think it is important to name that that is a resource that
Mm-hmm.
is what is accessible and helpful to some folks.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I know it's a little bit um polarizing, but they do help. Um so a lot of people carry intense shame for simply being human.
Mm-hmm.
Um how does someone begin to loosen that shame?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ah, so many folks carry such intense shame, and it permeates everything. Um, and I like to define what shame is, because I think sometimes we can get shame and guilt confused.
Yes.
And so one way that I will describe it is, guilt is the feeling that I did something wrong. So like if you and I were sitting at a table together and I have a water glass in front of me, and I talk with my hands a lot, I knock it over and I get you all wet.
Mm-hmm.
Guilt would be an appropriate thing to feel of, oh, I'm so sorry. Like I did knock this over and now you're all wet. What do I
Mm-hmm.
need to do to help make that better? Do I get
Right.
some towels? That kind of thing. Shame would be, okay, this very normal human thing happens. I knock over my water. Well, now I'm a bad person. I'm a horrible person. Like Rebecca shouldn't even be interacting with me. Nobody should interact with me. I deserve punishment. And so going into that place where we're moving away from, there was this action I did that caused some problems versus I am the problem. And that shame can be so deeply rooted. Um, and so one of the things that I have found that can be really helpful is developing self-compassion. Just being able to acknowledge, okay, yes, I knocked over my water because I'm a human, and sometimes humans knock over things, and that's okay. I am not worse than any other human. How would I react to a friend maybe in this same situation? What would I say to
Right.
them? How can I extend that to myself? How can I have some compassion toward myself as you're a human, so of course you functioned as a human.
Right. When someone has been in a high control environment, how can that affect their ability to make decisions later?
Mhm. So high control environments, and not just high control religious environments, that could be any kind of high control environment from a workplace to a family, to a religious environment, a political group. They're really built on there is a leader or a leadership structure that controls all of the decisions, tells you what is right and wrong, what you have to do to be acceptable to the group. Depending on the level of control, in some groups, you have to run every single decision by the leader, even of what can I wear tomorrow? How am I allowed to cut my hair? What am I allowed to eat? Like literally every decision of your life. So you don't develop that skill of making decisions. And so then folks, if they're exiting that, they realize like, wow, I don't know how to make a decision because I've never had to. Somebody else was always making the decisions for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels scary to make the decisions because a lot of times there also was the threat of consequences if you did something that was out of line with the group, if you did make your own decision. And so that can be something that folks are wrestling with of, okay, but even if I make my own decision, what is the consequences? And if anything that feels bad or off happens, their mind can immediately jump to, well, this is because I left the group. This
Yeah.
is because I made a decision without permission of the leader or whatever the leadership structure was.
Mm-hmm. Now I know in the first series of questions that you answered for me, um, we're talking a little bit about finding the right therapist and insurance and things like that. What should someone look for in a therapist if they're, healing from religious trauma or spiritual abuse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think anytime you're looking for a therapist, it's important to find someone who is very clear about what is their educational background, what are their credentials, what is their licensing, looking for a licensed therapist. Um, there definitely are folks who do good work like as coaches and other roles,
Mhm.
but those folks are also very clear about what their credentials are and what their
Right.
role is.
Hmm.
So that is a big one. Um, Specifically with religious trauma, thinking through, um, do you want a therapist who is religious or who is not religious or who I describe myself as spiritually inclusive. I work with folks who their faith is still important to them and they want to maintain it. And I also work with folks who don't want anything to do with faith and folks who are exploring spirituality
Hmm.
in different ways. Some of the folks I work with, we have been in all of those spots over the course of the time we were working together. But somebody might want to work with somebody that has a religious background or that doesn't. Um, and so thinking about what's important to you. It can be important to work with somebody that knows about your specific background. That's not always the case, but that can be important. I think it is important to find out what kind of training does this person have specifically with working with religious trauma,
Hmm.
um, because that it is a very complex type of trauma that
Sure.
includes betrayal and often other types of abuse that have happened. Um, and I really appreciate that now quite a few therapists are offering a free consultation before you schedule.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I offer. And I welcome folks to ask any questions that feel important to them. I recently posted a blog post about some questions that might be important to ask to a potential religious trauma therapist, so that you can make an informed decision about, is this a person I want to work with, and what is their approach to working with
Right.
religious trauma.
Right. Because that can be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it just might not click with you.
Yes,
You know.
that's a big one. I think a
Mhm.
lot of folks sometimes will feel like that they can't get anything out of therapy, or that they failed therapy, when
Mhm.
it's like maybe you just weren't a good fit for the therapist you were
Right.
working with, and there is
Mhm.
someone out there who's a good fit.
Yeah.
I will also I will also say, I know some therapists are very committed to one specific type of therapy.
Mhm.
And they will say, like, I offer EMDR, I offer internal family systems, or whatever it might be. I have training in a lot of different types of therapy, and I don't think there is a one size fits all for every
Mhm.
person. So
Absolutely.
I feel like it's helpful to have a variety of things to pull from,
Mhm.
to help support somebody. But there probably are people who are like, no, I want this one thing, and I want to work with somebody that this is the only thing they do.
Yeah.
So that would make a difference in whether somebody's a good fit for you or not.
Mhm. Okay. Well, it's getting close to time for us to wrap up, but I did want to give you the opportunity to speak a little bit about, where can people find you, learn more about you, whatever projects you're working on, and just the floor is yours.
Thanks. I am pretty much always working on something related to one of these three areas. I do a lot of, in addition to doing individual therapy and group therapy in North Carolina, I do a lot of educational workshops, and speaking engagements and things like that as well on these topics. And folks can find more information about me on my website. So it's my name, MichelleFMoseley.com. And Moseley is Moseley. Um, and I'm also on Instagram. My handle there is at therapy_with_Michelle. And so I post quite often about mental health in general, about religious trauma, about neurodivergence, about weight inclusive care, and about things that I might have coming up, happening in the future. So folks are definitely welcome to connect in either of those ways.
Okay, great. Well, this has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed talking with you today. And thank you for taking some time out of your extremely busy schedule to come talk with me.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to get to share more about because all three of these areas are special interests to me. So excited to
Absolutely.
be able to share more about it with you and with your audience.
Well, thank you so much. And I will be in touch and we'll let you know when the show is going to air. Should be shortly.
Okay, sounds
Okay.
good.
Thank you so much, Michelle. You have a great evening.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This has been Unfinished Conversations. Thanks for tuning in. Catch us next Friday for a new episode.